Good morning, everybody. This is Ed Avis. I'm the Managing Director of APDSP, and I want to welcome you to our webinar this morning. Thank you very much for joining us. Before I introduce our panelists today, I'd like to note that you can ask questions by using the questions panel on your screen. Please feel free to post questions there at any time, and we will answer them after the speakers are done. But don't wait. Go ahead and post them immediately so that we can have them lined up. Today, we are very fortunate to have three speakers with good experience in this topic. Our first presenter will be Bob Purdy. He's the former owner of Jiffy Reprographics in Clearwater, Florida, who sold his firm a couple of years ago. Bob has deep involvement with our association. He was the president of IRGA in 2011-2012, and he's a Bukowski Award winner. Our second presenter will be David Fox. He's the former owner of Fox Blueprint in Salem, Oregon. And David, incidentally, sold his firm after an article was published about his company in the IRGA newsletter. And our third presenter today will be Doug Maggett, president of Blue Edge in New York. Blue Edge also has locations in New Jersey, Boston, Philadelphia, and Chicago. And he will be presenting on the view of a firm that is acquiring companies. So let's go ahead and dive right in. Bob, you're up. Please introduce yourself and begin your presentation.
Thank you, Ed. Good morning. Bob Ruperti, formerly with Jiffy Reprographics, Clearwater, Florida. In the 28 years we owned our business, I'm not sure how many times we contemplated selling. I'm sure every down day and every down market, and certainly every recession we went through. But, we enjoyed our friends, the associates in the business community, as well as the fact that we had formed these relationships among local organizations and charities. So it was really an epiphany moment when we said, look, we need more time for play, travel, and volunteering. Over the years, we had gone through a professional business evaluations. In the late 90s, a company called Geneva out of Chicago put together a rather elaborate presentation for us. And then a few years later, another firm who was specializing in mergers and acquisitions. And I think what we took from that was a basis for establishing the value of our company. They provided the outlines and the organization model, as well as the business brief that would be used to advertise our business for sale. And those are the elements I used for the content that I put into our business brief. I'd like to ask Ed to go ahead and put up the first slide, and that basically an elevation of our company. Ed, the second slide, if you don't mind. Some of the advanced preparation for the sale really started a couple of years beforehand. The building needed a good painting, and certainly so many work areas needed a facelift. Not only did we declutter, but we invited somebody else in to help us do the staging and decorating. And it was an important part of getting a more professional look before we went to market with the company. We scheduled all the major repairs, the big repairs, the tear downs on the TDS 800s, the Orca laminator, those things that take sometimes a week or more to complete because of parts availability, et cetera. But that was an important element. There's a lot of content in this slide, so I'm not going to read all of it to you, but I will say it was important to go through the employee areas and depersonalize some of those areas that had become somewhat a man cave or a lady cave, if you will. But it was also important to provide some scripting, some language for the individual employees so they could describe precisely what they do, what tools they use to complete their work, the types of software, and display some of the products that helped us in our production work. The atmosphere was important as well. Lighting, background music, the day-to-day cleanliness. We went through and changed our messaging in the answering machine as well as in the reception area so that we were consistent regardless of who answered the phone, and that the basic information was communicated to whoever was at the other end of the line. We went as far as the parking lot and reorganized so that it had a better ease of access, and someone became responsible for cleaning up out there as well. You know, the kinds of things to collect in a parking lot. And I think last and most importantly, through that period of time, I was collecting from my professional contacts an attorney that specialized in the business sale, a retired banker who had a pretty good look at our financials, and of course the accountant that I worked with through the course of years, who would have to verify the financials that were going to be presented. Ed, would you give the next slide, please? I think an important part of presenting our business to potential buyers was a business brief, and that came out of some of the earlier business evaluations. I'll give you a chance to read at least the first three, if you will. The general business description, where, when, what, how, who, and some of the important elements about the company. This is the type of thing you wouldn't mind seeing in the daily paper. An industry overview, and I pulled so much of this content from information that came out of the IRGA, but also pointing out the cyclical nature of our business and the risk associated with it. It's an important element for anyone who's considering a purchase. And then the sources of revenue. Ed, there's a slide there with a graphic, if you don't mind. It's the pie chart. For us, our business had changed so dramatically from the time we had evaluations. This pie chart looked like 75% AEC, and the rest was all others in the past. But as the recession took hold in 2007, we did a redirect and went very, very heavily into the area of commercial printing. We did that through outsourcing to a major printer that had opened up a brokerage operation for printers, and our business grew very, very dramatically, one of the fastest growing elements in our business. And the second area was large format digital graphics, and for most of you, you're already involved with that. But for us, it also meant partnering with people who had the ability to do vertical work with the lift buckets and the heavy duty trucks for putting up lettering on the sides of buildings and the facades, the molded signage and other things that we created back at the plant. So this type of a revenue breakdown kind of gave the prospects that we had a good idea of the markets that we were involved in. Ed, if you wouldn't mind going backward one slide now. One slide, there we go. Before we actually jumped into plant visitations and heavy dialogue with prospects, we sent out a confidentiality agreement as well as non-disclosure. Excuse me. We had that prepared by one of our attorneys, and the purpose of that was so that at least we could keep confidential the financial data, the customer list, and some of the key markets that we were involved in. This was a requirement before we went any further with any of our prospects. I want to interject at this point. We elected early in the game not to advertise within our industry. We felt that the reprographics industry had taken such a different turn since the 2007-2008 paradigm switch to digital files that our businesses and so many others had really gone across boundaries and lines and markets that we had not in the past been involved with. And we felt that there was a broader market out there that could appreciate the kind of broad scope of our business in the markets that were growing at a much higher rate than the reprographics business. We were experiencing a continued decline in large format black and white digital prints. And yet the commercial printing market was heading in the other direction with single digit growth. And yet when we got into commercial printing, it moved up that curve double digit for us. And we had a very, very strong client base that we'd never marketed to in the past, who bought on fairly early in the game when we started talking about high quality, short turn times, and competitive pricing. So let me pick up from there. The prospect confidentiality agreement, the non-disclosure agreement. Then we went through a prospect qualifier that we sent out. We had about 13, 14 companies that were very interested in our business. A couple of them were predominantly just investors. We wanted to know a little bit more about them, where the financing came from, who was actually the interested party, would they consider relocating to the Clearwater or Tampa Bay area, and whose name was going to be on that bill of sale. So that was an important element in discussing and agreeing that we were going to send out financials. We limited it to 3 or 4 prospects. Excuse me, I've got to get a drink of water here. The financials really consisted of 3 years of corporate taxes and cash flow analysis. And I'm going to get into that with a little bit more detail in just a moment. But also, we included exhibits, things like the asset list, existing contracts, agreements, employee agreements, which are an important part of how the company operates once the former owner is gone. Any of the issues legal in nature that might be pending, as well as loans and leases and all those awards and distinctions we built up through the years. Going back to the financials, I've got a slide here. Ed, if you don't mind, if you would put up the summary of cash flow. There we go. In the financial brief that we put together, not only did we have the previous 3 years of revenue, but in addition to that, we itemized these elements and then went through basically a restructuring of the financials so that it showed clearly what the earnings before interest and taxes were. We sidelined the owner's salaries as well as the owner's benefits. And when I say that, those items really become fairly considerable for many of us who have been around the communities it's the social events that we sponsor and those organizations that we join that are really at our country folks, and the vehicle expenses, the discretionary education, employee bonuses, and travel. Um, as we collected those year over year and added them back as employee of owner benefits, that earnings before interest and taxes, and then depreciation and amortization became a fairly significant amount. And it helped that EBIT number. I'm going to the last of the slides, the valuing the business. Ed, if you'll make, we were generally told that 3 to 4 times earnings, that EBIT number would be a basis for going from there. But actually, what we found was when we put seller considerations in there, and those are items that you can read, as well as all the other value that was within our business, things like the brand, how extensive that brand was, the market penetration, our ability to grow in new markets. We sold our company for 6 times earnings. That 2.5, almost 3 times our asset value. The way that we did sell was through a group called Biz Buy Sell. Biz Buy Sell. We had over 50 inquiries. We narrowed it down to 13 or 14, down to 2 companies bidding for the company at the end, and we took the one that had the best synergy in the area. We sold to another printer who was about the same size. He paid cash for the business. We walked, he doubled his business, and he got a very extensive customer list. So I'll take any questions you have later on, but I appreciate your time, and I'll pass it back to.
Thank you very much, Bob. That was very interesting. And I'm sure that people have some questions. And as I noted, if you have questions, please do use the questions panel on your screen and submit them that way, and we'll answer them at the conclusion. Now I'm going to turn it over to David Fox, who is former owner of Fox Blueprinting. David, please tell us your story.
All right, great. Thank you, Ed. And Bob, that was a great presentation. Mine won't be quite as thorough as that, but there's a lot of truth in terms of my transition. Anyway, I got a haircut, so anyway, yeah. So similar to Bob's business, we were in business 24 years. I started in Santa Rosa, California, which is down by San Francisco, working for other companies down there, and then up in the Seattle area. And when I ended up in Salem, Oregon, which is just a little south of Portland, I started my own business. And at that time, it was just a reprographics business for the construction document printing industry. That's what I knew, and that was back in 1993. And soon thereafter, I think within the first 6 months of me being in business, Hewlett Packard had come out with their first color plotting machine, the 650C. And that introduced us to the color market. Of course, in the beginning, we thought that technology was just going to, be for construction documents with colored lines on them, but I quickly learned that there was an entire different market available to us. And so we recognized early on the value of color printing, and subsequently became a strong contender in our community in that realm. We were probably the earliest company to really get involved in the color. However, it remained only about 25% of our business for many years, maybe up to about 30% of our business until the recession hit. And of course, that was a game changer for everybody. And so with the during the recession rather, we had to really start thinking about diversity in our community and in the services that we were offering. However, in my case, what our financial avenues also diminished within the recession. Not to mention, I had already been in business for quite a few years, and I didn't have the same willingness to take risk that I did when I was younger. I think one benefit to that is that none of us knew how bad the recession was going to be, and had I, borrowed more money to get, to diversify early on, I think I probably would have lost everything because it really was a deep recession. As we pulled out of it, which was a slow process, we did diversify. We did get, start doing more outdoor banner and signage type business. Really built up also like Bob, we outsourced more, not quite to the extent that they did, but we did do more outsourcing with other print shops in town just to secure a lot of our customers through outsourcing. And we really recognized the need for diversity, but I also got to a point where I wasn't feeling entirely confident about where our business was going, and we saw a number of businesses fail during and after the recession. So I started considering what my next step was, which was either to roll up my sleeves and take some big risks and borrow some money and really strengthen the diversity of the company, or entertain the idea of moving on and having a career change, which is ultimately what I did. I also advertised with Biz Buy Sell, which is the business that Bob sold through. We didn't have quite the same luck, and I think part of that was the valuation company that we used to evaluate our company was the one who set it up, and I just don't know that they really understood the type of printing that we do, the AEC and whatnot. And so we also had some investors that were interested in the business. Didn't understand that it really is a hands-on thing. The purchaser would need to be somebody who was willing to, come in and work and be part of the operation. After about a year, and we probably had a half dozen interested people, but nobody really was, either they came in and saw the business and realized there was a lot more to it than they wanted to take on, or they were investors who just wanted to sit back and collect checks from the business, and that wasn't going to happen either. I decided to go ahead and just take it off of the market and go for it. And I did so, and I bought a couple of machines, new machines, and then I talked to Ed, and I apologize. Let me back up a little bit. I talked to Ed before I took it off of the market, just right before, and he suggested, why don't we write a little article about what's going on. And so we did that, and it was a great article, very informative. But after a couple of months, I was already kind of half thinking about taking it off of the market, and I did so. But someone in the industry who had read the article enlightened a company up in the Seattle area that has about 20 locations, but they are primarily a equipment like copy machine and plotter sales and service company, as well as mailing equipment and printer supplies. Good sized company, but in light of the necessity to diversify to survive in this industry, this company was looking for print companies, and they had already purchased a downtown Seattle print company and a couple smaller print shops, and they were interested in taking a look at our company. And so, like Bob said, it was enlightening to me in terms of the reality that a repro shop, an AEC repro shop, is not interested in buying another AEC repro shop because we're all in the same boat. Our industry is changing significantly, and so it does make sense that somebody who's a peripheral business to your business is actually going to benefit more than a comparable business. And so this was actually a really good marriage. I met with the CEO of this company, and we had already had the company evaluated, and that was helpful in coming up with an agreement. And they bought the business from me and hired me. And then my salary actually increased with them hiring me to compensate for the owner benefits that I had as an owner of the business, such as travel, vehicle expenses, cell phones, and various things. So I was compensated for some of the owner benefits that I no longer had. And I guess that's in a nutshell. That is my story, and it worked out well for me. And I think the takeaway, at least from these first two presentations, is, if you do have interest in selling your business, look for businesses that have a complementary overlap to your business, who would benefit from what you do because they are not services that they are currently providing, and that'll you're looking for ways to strengthen another business. Sameness just isn't going to make sense in this new economy. And I think that's pretty much everything I have. I would again, at the end of the presentation, I'm open to answering any questions. But my story is pretty simple and straightforward.
Great. Thank you very much, David. Interesting story. Attendees, again, if you have questions for David or Bob, please, by all means, go ahead and put them into the questions panel. Now we're going to turn to Doug Maggot. Doug is the president of Blue Edge in New York. And Doug, please, go ahead.
Okay. Thanks, Ed. Thanks, Bob and David. It was always interesting to hear the presentations from the other side. I'm coming from the acquirer side, so it's definitely very interesting for me to hear. Our background is we've made about 8 acquisitions over the years, starting in 2001. We were on the acquisition path for a while until, I think, like most other acquirers, we really slowed that down, after the Great Recession. Since then, we've made 1 acquisition, 1 small one. So I would say, we're not as active as we used to be in that space, but, we're always kind of open to it, and our eyes and ears are open if opportunities present themselves. My thinking about how potential acquisitions, are going to be made is a lot different than it was back in the heyday. And I think, other acquirers would probably feel the same way. We think we're all more selective and more conservative, than we were, 10 years ago, for sure. The process itself really hasn't changed much, though. It's always been, and it's still been, about understanding the business of the firm you're looking at, its financials, and its leadership, and ownership team. So I'll describe the factors, that I consider and the order that I think about them. So I think the first thing I think about is if the potential acquisitions in one of our geographic markets or not. We're in about a half dozen cities now, and truthfully, those were all acquisitions. Other than New York, we got into all the other cities by acquisition. But our desire to be in new markets has changed. Whereas it used to be a plus for us, would get us into a new market. Back in the heyday. Now we see it in a different light. Whereas we're much more interested in a potential acquisition that's in one of our geographic markets. Because we're not looking to get into additional markets necessarily. And acquisitions in our markets are very attractive if we can, bring them into our existing operations. That's how we can really make it profitable. And that's, how we can, probably justify paying, a price that's going to that's going to close an acquisition. If we're just buying a business and running it, as a standalone, it may be harder to get to a price that, where we can pay a price where it has a value to us that's going to be, sufficient to make the acquisition. So I think that's the first thing we look at. And it's not just a dollars and cents thing. It's also a work and an effort kind of thing. In a city that we're in, it's fairly easy for us to integrate a business. It puts a lot less strain on our leadership team. In a new market, in a new city, we know we're gonna have to put in a lot more time and effort. And it's not to say that we haven't done that, and we have done one of those, since the Great Recession. But I think we're a lot more selective, in cities where we don't have a presence. I think that the second thing I would look at, which is also very fundamental, is just the overall health of the business. In other words, is it profitable? Does it have a good reputation? Does it have good people, good leadership? The latter two I mentioned are subjective, and they can be sometimes somewhat hard to assess if it's a business that I'm not already familiar with. But nonetheless, it's something that we have to try and do. And so the thinking is here, I'd rather pay more for a healthy business than, pay less and get a bargain, which is going to take us, a tremendous amount of work and effort and years to turn around potentially. And the risk inherent in that is it's not really worth it for us. So I'd rather get a better business, even though I know I'm going to have to pay more for it. Obviously, also key in looking at any business today is it in a growing market, or is it in a shrinking market? So if it's a business that's still 90% AEC repro, then we know it's probably going to shrink after we acquire it. Whereas if it's in, say, wide format printing market, something like that, we assume that it has a growth trajectory. So that's really critical as well. Next question is also a critical one. And there's no right or wrong answers here. We want to know, what the leadership wants to do. Typically, the ownership is the leadership, but whoever's running the company, what are their plans post-acquisition? And here, we just want to be able to, there's no right or wrong answer. We just want to be able to plan for the future and know what we're getting. We've had owners, tell us that they want to get out, retire, and move away, and that's fine with us. We've had them stay on for a month in the transition and then move on, and that worked great. We've also had it work out great where we've had owners stay over 10 years and retire with us. That's happening shortly with one of our former acquisitions, and that worked out great too. So what we really just want is honesty, and not saying what you think we want to hear, but say what your plans really are, and then we can kind of work it out together. I think one caveat for owners is just knowing that if you stay with a company that acquired you, you are going to have to adapt your way of doing things and accept not having the final say in things. So then that can be hard to do. I know that would be difficult for me if the tables were turned. And I think it requires a total change in perspective. And I've seen it with some former owners where, it works fine. They're totally on board with that. They, probably keep running their location or their division, within the umbrella of the company, and that's worked fine. And I've had others where I think it's been frustrating for them to sometimes, to find out that they may have certain ideas for how to run the business, and we may not share those ideas. So it's something that, to really do some soul searching about and think about if you want to stay on, if it's going to work for you or not. And, when I talk about the leadership, we certainly are looking at the CEO, but we're also looking at the VP of sales, if there is one, and any, top salespeople, wanting to know, are they going to stay on? That's really critical for us to know. And, typically there with the sales and sales leadership, there we really do want to know that they are staying. And if realistically they're not, then we at least have to know that there are non-competes in place. That is critical, or we could buy a business and, if we lose the clients, we really, haven't gained much. We're not looking to buy somebody's equipment, or hire their staff if there's not the sales, behind it to support it. That's really the, more than anything else, we're hiring the talent and the client list. Next, we get into, start to get into a little bit more specifics, and we think about, is the company we're looking at going to bring us any unique capabilities, something that we don't offer now, some expertise we don't have. So, an example is about 8 years ago, we acquired a firm that was very strong in small format digital, and that was something, that we didn't really have a business in outside of AEC. And they also brought clients in industries that we didn't do business in. We were very much AEC focused, and their small format business was mainly, pharma and other industries. So that, they brought something special to the table, and for that, we're willing to pay more, and we're going to be more interested in. I think the next, kind of last checkpoint is, are we in the same ballpark as to how to value the business? So, at this point, I haven't even seen full financials. I probably just know, a rough sales and bottom line number. So we're not talking about actual, numbers to value the business yet, but we're talking about how are we going to arrive at a valuation. So I think it's really critical that there be kind of a shared methodology to that, at least in general terms, that, it's going to be based on, for example, a multiple of EBITDA, or, if there's no EBITDA, then a multiple of sales. Those are universal standards that are used and help us determine the price, as opposed to sometimes a seller may come with a certain price in mind because they know what they need to retire on. But that's not obviously what's going to drive our valuation of the business. So I think it's important just to come with a common basis. And sometimes that's even agreed upon, early in the process. And if you do, then you stand a good chance of being able to reach a deal. And if you don't, it's probably just not worth, investing anybody's, time and efforts in it. So I think it's good to just get the outlines in place before you go further. Make sure you're in, on the same page. Lastly, once we get through that, if it's still intriguing to both sides, then we got to drill down into the financials. Obviously, we'll get all the details 3 years back. Full financials and any kind of if there are any kind of legal issues. We'll have lots of questions. We're going to leave no stones unturned. It's not a fast process, but it's an important one to go through and make sure we've wrapped our arms around it fully. One challenge in buying a business, I think, always is that it's common to lose, I'd say, and anywhere from, a little to a third of the sales during, and after the transition for any number of reasons. Sometimes we've lost very little. Sometimes we've lost, as I said, up to a third. And it just, I think you have some sense going in as to how solid are the accounts. and are these things that you can transition or not. But that's something that we have to kind of try and assess and think about, as we're looking at the numbers. So to the extent that key people are staying on board, and to the extent that there are contracts in place, I know that may not be the case in a lot of companies, but some companies where their FM business, their MPS business is a big part of their business. There are contracts in place. Those are things which are important and help us value the business higher, because we're more confident that we're going to hold on to the business. Whatever happens a couple years or more out is up to us, really, and can we, the kind of service we provide. But we want to at least know that the clients are, not going to jump ship during a transition, for any reason, because somebody's leaving or for whatever reason may be associated with the transition. So that's basically, the process. I'll just throw in there in terms of the numbers that usually people give us forecasts. And, although they're interesting, forecasts going forward, we don't put much faith in them. We really base the decision on what we see in front of us. We can't, the forecasts are naturally always rosy. And I just don't think that many people value the, businesses based on those. We kind of have to go on, the here and the now. So, that's the process. Kind of in closing thoughts about, I was asked to mention, what gets me excited about an acquisition, and what turns me off about a potential acquisition. And, I think they're pretty much flip sides here. What gets me excited, or makes me, maybe a better term is makes me feel more comfortable, because I think that's equally important, is speaking with an owner, who's open and honest about the business and about his personal plans for, post-acquisition. Look, we realize, every business, ours included, has some warts. And as long as we know what we're getting into, we think, we can generally, deal with the issues that are going to come up, again, especially if it's within our geography. Then we're really confident we can make it, we can work out and iron out any, issues in the business. We want to see, ideally, good people that are going to be continuing on, who can help us make that transition and continue to manage the business going forward. It's not a must, but it's a plus. And, if you want to speak ideally, obviously, we're looking for a company that's showing some growth, both top line and bottom line. Even if it's just, low single digits, but just the trajectory that they're moving in the right direction is great. At the same time, we realize that's not always realistic today. So it's not a make it or break it. The biggest turnoff is really easy for me to say. And what it is, stories and, numbers that just really, seem to us to be slanted, at best, or at worst, potentially untrue. A lot of times we'll get a story as to why somebody's, wants to sell that just doesn't sit right with us. We don't believe it. A lot of times we'll get people talk about some of their costs and why we should disregard them, that they're personal costs that are very, extensive, that won't be ongoing, or there are lots of one-time large expenses that, aren't ongoing, or that they're about to land, a huge client, next month. So, all of those things may or may not be true, but they're not things that we consider. Again, we look at what all we can do, responsibly, which is to kind of look at the here and now. If the financials, raise too many questions, all of that's a big turnoff. And I would say, by far, that is what has led us to drop deals and, walk away. Because quite honestly, if there's not trust, it's just a lot, there'll be other opportunities. It's just a lot easier for us to walk away, because we know we don't really know what's there until we, consummate an acquisition and integrate it. So there are enough question marks without kind of adding additional trust factors there. So, I think that's the key, the key thing for us. It's like buying a house. When you buy a house, you know that if you rip away, some of the sheetrock, you're gonna find something behind it that you didn't expect, and we accept that. That's true in any business, but you at least want to be able to trust the buyer that whatever they know, they've been upfront about. And if that trust is there, and both parties are reasonably flexible, then I think there's a good chance then of a deal being made. So that pretty much wraps up what I wanted to share today with everybody. I thank you for your time and definitely open to questions.
Great. Thank you very much, Doug. Very interesting to get your perspective on this situation after hearing from Bob and David. So attendees, I want to remind you again that you can ask questions now, and we will address them. And if we run out of time, we will take the questions via email. But we do have a number of questions that have been presented. The first one I'll just answer myself, and that is, will the slides be available? Yes, this session is being recorded along with the slides and the audio, and it will be posted later today on our website. Okay, I'm going to move on to the other questions now, and what I'm going to do is unmute the other speakers so that they can reply to these questions as appropriate. Bob, there's a question for you that said, if you were to equate your sale price compared to your gross sales, what would that ratio be?
It's about 83% of our actuals.
Bob, we're having a little hard time hearing you. Can you repeat that, please?
Yeah, a quick calculation, a little over 80% of our gross sales came into our selling price.
Understood. Great. Thank you. Let me move to another question. And this is to Bob, but David, feel free also to reply. And that was, would marketing to select repro companies, including possibly a competitor, possibly bring an even better return on the sale of the business?
Actually, I have we did talk to my competitor in my town, and I think the valuation company did not necessarily think it was a good idea based on their experience. However, I thought that my competitor would be the biggest beneficiary of that sale, because they would be gaining all of my business, and I think they would get way more out of it than any other buyer. However, they did show interest. Of course, by the time it was all said and done, I am convinced that they did it just to figure out what our financials were. They made an insultingly low offer on the business that we just didn't even respond to, except to say, yeah, we're end of conversation. And as a result, now they have a pretty strong competitor in town. But in my case, it was not necessarily a very good idea, even though you think naturally that would be the one to benefit most.
And Bob, do you have a feeling on that, promoting to your competition?
Yeah, we had an inquiry from an Atlantic company that did acquisitions in a variety of different markets, and their assessment of the asset value was extremely low. And so, as Doug said, we couldn't find that level of understanding to how to get to value with them, and so we conversation. A competitor, local competitor, became aware through service representative that worked on our equipment, and much the same. I think he wanted us to sell and finance, and we were more interested in the two cash that we had. So I guess we ruled those out early in the game. I found that in the industry, falling revenue, many of the prospects do not value other photographers well.
Okay, thank you, Bob. Here's another question. Was the valuation based on the most recent fiscal year, the last 12 months, or the average of historical sales of the last 3 years? Bob, can you reply to that?
I can come out of the recession very strong, and so the 3-year period that we compared showed double-digit growth, and the significance of that was in the markets that I mentioned: commercial printing, large signage, and the interest market. They to the bottom line, the ability to consolidate services both locations. The answer is it was based on a combination of the 3 years and a pro forma that's already quite good. He had first quarter to deal with, and once again, double-digit growth in that first quarter. That numbers were consistent.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to jump around on these questions, and I apologize if I'm skipping some. Here's one for Doug. Doug, regarding the dollars and cents aspect, can you cite 2 examples of the basic relationship between revenue/profit and purchase price for 2 of the acquisitions you made?
Sure, I'll try and answer that. I'm not, and you'll tell me if I've kind of covered it. But I'd say what we did in the past may not apply now. I think everybody's familiar. I think Bob used 4 to 6 times EBITDA as kind of an industry standard industry range. So I think we followed. I'd say we followed that. We're probably usually at the lower end of that. I think nowadays I don't know if there is an industry standard, but I hear 3 times EBITDA thrown around as one standard. So I think that's probably about what things would go for today. And I threw out sometimes it's a multiple of sales, because nowadays sometimes there is no EBITDA, right? If EBITDA is 0, how do you value the company? So it's obviously not going to get an extremely high value at that point. Or if EBITDA is very small, like a few percent of sales, it's not really something you can use. In those cases, I think those are more turnaround situations, and I think each of those is pretty unique. But I'll say in terms of if I would ballpark in terms of sales, in those situations, it's maybe 50% of sales, so something like that. Again, each situation has to be looked at independently.
Okay, good. Thank you, Doug. A couple of people have noted that the audio on Bob's replies was a little broken up. So I want to note that I'm going to have the recording of the call transcribed, and I will post key answers on the website. So if you missed something that you wanted to hear, you can go to our website later, and you will be able to read that. Let me go to another question here. This is for Bob or David, and the question is, did you sell the buildings in the transaction, meaning the real estate? David, would you like to answer that?
Yeah, we actually do not own our building. We're a historic building downtown that's been owned by the same family for over 100 years. So
Understood. Bob, how about you?
We owned a couple of buildings in Clearwater. We sold those the year before, 2 years in one case, and the year before in the other. And we had negotiated good leases building where the business was located.
Thank you. Another question for Bob and David. Can you explain how you found and qualified a company to value your company, and what was the cost associated with that? Bob?
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just
Go
going to say, I found it through, just through the grapevine, through a Rotary referral, and the cost was going to be 10%, but of course, since they did not find my buyer, we still had them handle the documents for the sale, and just agreed on a very reasonable price for that. But 10%, I think, is the going rate.
Bob?
Yeah, I think that's a solid number, David. Late 90s, I mentioned that Geneva Corporation got into the mix. They had a flat fee structure that was in the high teens for the evaluation, and then the company out of Atlanta had a $5,500 price range for their initial services. The documents that they provided followed somewhat the similar model as Geneva Corporation out of Chicago. We had a couple of brokers that were in generally in the 8% range on the business sale, and assistance in doing evaluation on the business, but we couldn't agree on the baseline, and they were not, an education in our industry takes years. A broker had hours, and we found it a lot easier to describe our business to potential prospects directly, and the business brief did a good job of that.
Thank you. We are almost done, and I've promised our panelists that we would not go over an hour, so I'm not going to bring any new questions in, but I would like to ask Doug a question, and that is, when you are dealing with a purchase situation, do you have a preference for working directly with a owner or working through a business broker type person?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. We can really work either way. I wouldn't say I have a preference, especially because when there's a business broker involved, typically what happens is, they contact us, they send out, usually a mass mailing, or they may call us specifically and tell us a little bit about we'll sign a non-disclosure, and then we'll get some more information. And usually after that point, we're really dealing with, with ownership and, leadership of the company, because they're really the only ones that can answer, our questions. And so, working through a business broker is usually just the first step anyway. So, all in all, it can be helpful just in that you'll as an acquirer tend to get a more standardized and complete package to start the process, which can be helpful.
Got it. Understood. Thank you.
Ed?
Yes.
I just wanted to, real quick, if it's all right, just to kind of reinforce some of what Doug was saying earlier on the buyer's end. A couple of things that we did in our sale to sweeten the deal for the buyer and maybe make it a little bit more interesting for the buyer is, of course, I agreed to stay on board for 6 months, so a nice solid overlap. We have a lot of social capital in town, and it just kind of helps to keep me there for a while. But also with the sale of the business, I agreed to accept 2/3 of the payment for the business right up front, and then the other third after 6 months. And with that, I was given a dollar amount that I needed to reach every month during that 6 months. And that was for them to ensure that I wasn't going to have short timers real bad and, not be focused on the business. But I just wanted to share that buy-in for the seller is really going to help a buyer feel more comfortable with the transaction.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Well, thank you, everybody, especially Bob, David, and Doug, our panelists. Your insight have been valuable, and I'm sure the attendees enjoyed it and learned something from it. I would like to remind you that I will post the recording of this webinar on our website later today, and later on this week, a transcription or excerpts from the transcription. And if there are any questions that came in that were not answered, I will try to email those to the appropriate people and get answers to those directly. But thank you all again. Please take a moment to look at your slide. The last slide there, where we have some other webinars and our annual convention coming up in October. It's going to be a very valuable convention for learning marketing and how to improve your sales. So thank you everybody again very much. And this concludes today's webinar.